My name is Daniel Crawford. Welcome to the Inequality Chronicles. Our stories tonight: when the IMF worries about low wages, kids in need of dorms, how to build a plutocracy in 30 years, and when you say wealthiest country, who are you talking about? Story number 1. When the IMF worries about low wages. The article's title: IMF calls on the U.S. to hike its minimum wage rate. The source is CNBC. The author is Katie Little, and the publishing was June 16th. The bullet points. For the first time in its history, the International Monetary Fund has called for the United States to raise its minimum wage. According to the IMF, our minimum wage is too low both historically and compared to the rest of the world's developed countries. Also, the IMF has reduced their projections for our economic growth this year by a percentage point, citing the harsh winter's influence in causing a first quarter contraction. The organization noted that climate change is undoubtedly contributing to an increase in extreme weather events in the past 20 years as compared to the past 100 years. Some brief comments. Just a little side note before I get to commenting on this. I want to try and make these shows as pleasant and easy to watch as possible. I don't want to just keep droning on and on about an issue, so I'm going to try and speed through without losing some of the value of what needs to be discussed in all of this. The quality of this coverage. I know these are not my original reporting. I'm just simply sharing with you articles that you may have missed over the past week, or that may have been buried by their respective newspapers. Anyways, just a few quick points on each of these. It says something significant that the International Monetary Fund is concerned about our minimum wage. Usually you don't associate the IMF with concerns about the ills of people who are in a desperate condition. And knowing that they are telling us, hey, it's time to do this, it sort of leaves you with this impression that they are worried that our low minimum wage, the low buying power of it, is going to affect us in the long term, which could in effect threaten the long-term stability of our economy and the world's economy overall. And the fact that they cited the harsh winter condition and how it influenced the first quarter of this year's economic growth, they obviously are taking note of the fact that because of the already weak condition of our recovery, we are even more, prone to being badly impacted by even the slightest shift in weather patterns. And even more so when it comes to weather patterns that are record-breaking, disastrous level. It's bad, and that's why they also point out this threat of climate change, because if we don't address income inequality and we continue to be weak, we will become more susceptible to whatever the ebb and flows of our economy that could be caused by climate change itself in the future. Droughts, especially, floods, tornadoes, what have you. It all could have a huge impact on our economic growth in the future. And that's more or less what they're saying. If we don't do something now, at least in the form of increasing our minimum wage, this weakness in the face of the unpredictability of nature, it's just going to get worse. Excuse me. remember, I don't have to actually make it to half an hour. It's more of a time limit for myself to just put a cap on. So increasingly over time, just to make these episodes as appealing as possible, I'm going to try and make it to where I don't just drone on and on. I just want to get right to the point. After I've made my point, I'm going to just move on. If it lasts for half an hour, so be it. But anyway, this is just a note for future reference. Trying to make this as appealing as possible. Anyways, story number 2. Kids in Need of Dorms. The article's title, Homeless College Students and the Fight to Escape Poverty Through Education. The source is The Guardian. The author is Jana Kasperkevic. I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that right. And the date was June 8th. The bullet points. Regardless of their plans for future education and careers, the Children Advocacy Institute says that roughly 37% of foster care children wind up homeless by their mid-20s. The Department of Education reports that more than 1 million public school students are homeless. Thanks to the Department of Education's more broad definition of homelessness, homeless students have a chance to pursue a higher education since the department allows them to be classified as independent and seek grants and loans which can help them pay for school and get a place to stay. Currently, there is a bill, with little chance of passing in the current Congress, authored by Senate Democrats to help the homeless by clarifying what it means to be homeless, and to require that colleges do more to help them pay for their education, as well as provide their temporary housing in which they can stay between semesters. This is another attempt of mine. In the previous episode, I believe there was nothing pertaining to the homeless issue, but as I've mentioned in previous episodes, I want to try and bring this up as much as possible, even if it is to briefly highlight it. But this also connects to the education issue, which both are obviously related to inequality. And as I've mentioned before, there is this disturbing trend of making our workforce more and more dependent on higher education, while at the same time the cost of the higher education keeps elevating. And you see here, there is somewhat of a crisis going on that is kind of conflating the issue of homelessness and the increase of the education cost by this new development, apparently, of homeless college students. I mean, granted, this particular study talks about foster care children and the adopted, as you'll read if you go through that article, and how, when their time is up, once they've turned 18, they're out on the streets and left to their own devices. But it's not just them. There are others as well. People who just get kicked out by their parents. Parents have done their part, in their minds. And this is because there is this disconnect between what the previous generation was able to do once they got out of high school and what the current generation can do now. The previous generation, from the late 40s, mid to late 40s, all the way up until mid 80s at the latest, you were able to get out of high school and go into a good paying job. And members of the previous generation don't seem to quite grasp that millennials don't have that opportunity anymore, because we're on the back end of all the consequences of outsourcing and deindustrialization. We no longer have the opportunity to just get out of high school and go right to a good paying living wage job. We don't have the option of going to school, going to higher education or not, in order to provide for our family. We absolutely have to in order to provide. But then by doing so, we incur all this debt that wasn't even a factor for the most part in previous generations when they went for higher education, as you'll learn in, I believe, the next story. I mean, the fact that students have to depend on getting a loan for school just to be able to, get an apartment or whatever for themselves. They have to incur debt just to be able to get a place to live. It's just, how does that make you feel? I'm glad there are members of Congress who are wanting to do something by requiring colleges to try and think of a plan to house students for at least the time being that they are a student. But, even in between semesters. Even if, of course, the current Congress is just completely ineffective right now. It's inept. But that well-meaning intent goes nowhere. What we need is action. We need clear definitions of homelessness. I didn't even realize that the homeless had to struggle in such a way, and I guess that's the other part of this. I'm even learning myself quite a bit about the struggles of homeless, so I thought it was important to bring those issues up. Well, that issue up, rather. Anyway, story number 3. How to Build a Plutocracy in 30 Years. The article's title, College Costs Expose the False Meritocracy of the American Dream. The source is The Guardian, yet again. The author is Chris Arnade, and the date was June 18th. Bullet points. Even after adjusting for inflation, the cost of higher education has skyrocketed by 300% in the last 3 decades. Too many businesses are mostly only hiring graduates from Ivy League schools, considered to be safe, despite the fact that there isn't any substantial difference between what you learn in those institutions and other less fancy yet cheaper options. Education's elevating costs makes the notion of paying for one's education via summer jobs, which may actually hurt your resume in the end due to a lack of time spent as an intern in the field to which one hopes to gain access, a laughable relic of the past. Effectively, these hurdles create increasingly insurmountable barriers between rags and riches. This, obviously, highlights this false notion that by getting an education, your dreams are just right around the corner. If the really good paying jobs are being highly selective about who they hire, you're looking for degrees from certain schools, their preferred schools, then that is creating more obstacles than what is economically necessary. That just shows that the social ladder is collapsing. It just is. Because when you prefer the Ivy League schools, which are a lot more expensive, and usually are only attended by children of people who are already well off to begin with, you're just creating this isolated society within the broader society. This group of affluent people who will just be able to pass on their affluence to their descendants while everyone else around them continues to suffer. It's plutocracy. It's also an aristocracy of sorts. And of course, this is nothing news to anyone who's been paying attention long enough. As it says in there is no real difference between what you learn in an Ivy League school and what you learn in a public college or any other institution that is respectful and is at least accredited. All you really have is the name brand. It's like when you go to a grocery store and you see 2 boxes of cereal. You see one that's a name brand cereal, and you see one that's the store brand. Of course, because you've seen the commercials for it, you want to choose a name brand. I knew growing up that I didn't want the generic version of Fruit Loops. I wanted real Fruit Loops. Of course, in the end, my mom, knowing that it was best, and a better way to stretch out money by getting the store brand. And she would always tell us, tastes the same. It's just the same thing. And in the end, she was pretty much right. I mean, the flavor may be like slightly different, but it's basically the same thing. It's kind of the same thing with colleges. You have the name brand college, and you have the generic brand college. And the generic brand is more easily accessible, affordable, but it basically satisfies the same desires. It satisfies the same, I don't want to call them needs, but it provides the same services, in effect. And it's just, we have these unnecessary barriers, and it is doing nothing to improve our society. And it's high time that we address this. Oh yes, before I forget, this part about the summer jobs thing. I know a few people with whom I actually work, some of them, who have the job where I work or another like minimum wage jobs, and they work there with this notion that it's just their summer job. It helps them pay for school. But they also have a family that is more well off, so they're not really just paying for school by themselves. They're helping to pay for it, helping to pay for whatever things they like to get while they're at school. I'm not trying to diminish, their hard work or anything. It's just I've heard plenty of people argue, we don't want to do anything about the minimum wage because these jobs are just for people who are these jobs need to just be available for students, high school students and college students. That's about it. It's just a training. What we're forgetting is because of what's happened to our economy over the past few decades, this has become the economy. So yeah, it says, basically the summer jobs can actually hurt your resume because you're not serving that time as an unpaid intern. And when you think about it, who are the only people who can afford to devote time to being an indentured servant for a sustained period of time just for the experience? Who are the only people who can achieve that? It's not me. It's not anyone else within the poor class. No, because time is money. And when you're already in a desperate enough situation, you got kids, or even when you're just living on your own, or if you're one of those homeless, students, you can't afford to give up time as an intern. So yeah, your resume gets hurt in the end because you had to work a job to provide for yourself while you were waiting for your education to benefit you. This is part of this little, I want to call it a veil, a shroud that these people have placed around themselves, around their community. It's the gated part of our society, keeping everyone else out. And as long as you have these types of preferences, these type of discriminatory practices within our workforce, there's no real hope. Anyways, moving on to story number 4. When you say wealthiest country, who are you talking about? The article's title, The Coming Tsunami of Debt and Financial Crisis in America. The source, yet again, is The Guardian, and the author is Dimitri Papa Demetrio, sorry. Did not mean to butcher your name. And the date of its publishing was June 15th. The bullet points. The Levi Economics Institute is seeing a resurgent rise in personal debt as the cost of our society's inequality are being shifted from the collective to the individual. Well, the bottom 90% of Americans, that is. Devoid of major government investments or a sudden boom in exports, the economy's growth is expected to continue down its sluggish path until the unsustainable nature thereof finally blows up within the next decade. The Institute also found a correlation in the current trend of how the rich are enhancing their wealth while everyone else enhances their debt, and discovered that this trend started about 4 decades ago when the prosperous post-war era started to taper off. Between 1983 and 2010, the upper fifth of our society saw their riches boosted by 100% as the lower two-fifths experienced an astronomical loss of 270%. Think about that. That last little part there. The upper fifth of society enjoyed an increase of the riches by 100%, while the lower two-fifths, 40%, saw a drop of 270% of their collective wealth. This debt crisis that is emerging is because the costs of our society, as it says, are being shifted. You know, the wealthiest among us are enjoying all the fruits of this accumulated wealth. And they are not pumping it back into the economy. They are not doing their part. Yeah, their taxes were increased a little bit, a smidge, to the Clinton era levels. And honestly, as much as I support, tax increases, when it's necessary to help pay for the things that you've done in the past, I thought that, I don't know, who knows, it may have been premature. Over time, if the economy booms again, those rates do need to eventually go up for everyone, so everyone can do their part to pay back. But that just can't happen if our economy is going to continue to remain as sluggish as it is. So I guess, if anything, the people who are hoarding all this wealth need to pay more. And we're talking about just income taxes with that. They also have capital gains, which are taxed at a much lower rate. But that's just it. The costs are all being shifted to everyone else. The rest of us are having to pick this up by incurring more debt. More personal debt. Yeah, we're able to spend more now, but our future, values are depleting. So it's going to come back to haunt us. The distribution of wealth in this country is anemic. And it's not healthy, as you've heard me talk about plenty of times by now. So contemplate everything I've said here in those, and now, of course, for our final recap. One of the world's most notorious supervillain institutions, the IMF, has done something that is seemingly uncharacteristic of them by endorsing a policy which will legitimately help millions of poor people via an increase in the minimum wage. Reason being that they recognize the threat that inequality poses to the world's economic health. The homeless aren't entirely unmotivated or lacking hope, but they do currently lack a society compassionate enough to assist them, even if they show a willingness and determination to improve their lives. That is, if they plan to do so without plunging themselves into a sea of debt. Going to college is no longer a guaranteed ride out of poverty, because the most important opportunities are being reserved for the people fortunate enough to be born out of poverty and whose educational background involved an Ivy League school made accessible via their privileged birth. The next economic crisis is right around the corner. It will be directly related to the dangerous rise in inequality. Interestingly, the government could prevent this next bubble burst by rediscovering the importance of economic interventionism. Now, briefly, I just want to say as this show continues to go on, I want to keep exposing these issues. There was a brief concern of mine that, a few weeks in, I'd start to run out of stories to be able to cover, but I find myself week after week just sort of inundated with articles to sift through to put them on this show. The articles that don't make it to the show, I try to share through social media, just because I still consider them to be important enough. These are the ones I consider to be the top 4 that you may have missed. 9 times out of 10, if I've seen a story that, if you pay attention, you've probably seen, shared through other channels, I won't share it on this show. At least I'll try to avoid doing so that way you're not reading something you've already read before. I want this show to be as interesting as possible, and I want it to make somewhat of an impact, at least on helping you to be informed as to what's happening in your name. The degradation of our social ladder, the increase of inequality, and the negative impacts that this is having on our democracy. Because it is having that impact on our democracy. I mentioned before that I do legitimately fear, the threat of social upheaval if things aren't addressed soon, because it's something that history teaches us. So, with that, again, thank you for watching, and that's that. Have a good night.